Hey folks, we're back with the Contrarians, and today we're going to take a look at Deep Purple's catalog. We're going to ask Martin what he thinks the best Deep Purple album is, in his opinion.
Yes, so as you know, on the Contrarians, what we tend to do is, well, with the whole premise of what we do, is we look for catalogs where one of the three of us on the team here has a wild, an oddball choice for favorite album of the catalog. And for me, with Deep Purple, this is one I get a lot of stick about, a lot of complaint when we have these debates. I've pretty much come to the realization that my favorite Deep Purple album of all time is Perfect Strangers. We've got Perfect Strangers up here, signed by Ian and Roger. Here's two of my Deep Purple books. These I have available at my site, martinpopoff.com. They're basically a big timeline and quotes idea. I also had another couple of books called Getting Tighter and Castle Full of Rascals, but the first one's out of print. I do have a little bit more of the Castle one, long story, so these are the only Deep Purples I have for now. So, basically, I have picked Perfect Strangers, and it almost comes down to this idea of it is the classic Mark II lineup. Is it old enough? Is it classic enough, given that we're back into the early 80s here, where you can say it deserves to be not considered a new album and examined on the merits of what is on it, all along. I mean, there are obviously the obvious choices, which Mark was going to talk about, which are considered more so by more fans, the best Deep Purple albums, but I just find this one, start to finish, quite solid, very interesting, very accessible. I'll leave it there for now. What do you have to say about Perfect Strangers?
I mean, it's going to be kind of a hard debate for me, because honestly, it's not a bad album. I don't think it's the best Deep Purple album, and actually going back and listening to it, I was kind of surprised at how much I was actually liking the album leading up to this episode. But when I hear some of the sounds, like some of the synthesizers, some of the effects on the vocals kind of date it. It sounds kind of 80s. And even like right before this album was Born Again from Black Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
And right in that like 1 year between, it sounds like Ian Gillan's voice ages in that 1 year quite a bit. His voice, he sounds a little older, not in a good way. He's not screaming as much as he is on the earlier albums, which some people might like that better.
Yeah.
Some people like the screams less. Yeah. But for me, again, leading up to this episode, I kept thinking about, okay, what's my favorite Deep Purple album? And I kept thinking, Machine Head. But once I went back and started listening to the older albums, I really started to dig in rock. I like, it sounds a little grittier.
Yeah.
The production's not quite as good as some of the later albums. I mean, Ian Gillan's voice sounds like it was kind of recorded in a can at some points in that album. But between those two albums, Machine Head is super solid. I think I like every song on that album.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, those are the two choices, Deep Purple in rock and Machine Head, 1970, 1972, in between his Fireball. Deep Purple in rock is super important because it really is one of those three, the triumvirate there's actually four albums that invented heavy metal. Basically, Black Sabbath in February 1970, Paranoid in, I think it's October 1970, Deep Purple in rock in, I think it's July of 1970, and I think right around that time is also Uriah Heep, Very Heavy, Very Humble. It actually, in my mind, it's not the first of those four, but it's the best of those four. It's super heavy, throughout, and really modern sounding, except for Child in Time. That is the one I get the most. The Deep Purple fans often pick that one over Machine Head. But getting back to my choice here, the reason I like this one, I mean, we can talk a little bit about Machine Head, but the reason I like this album is it's interesting what you say about the vocals. I never really thought about it that way. I find the production is perfectly fine. I like the production, but the songs are pretty incredible and pretty heavy. And I love the fact that here is Mark II coming back, and this thing goes platinum, right? So I love Knocking at Your Back Door. Great, it was probably the biggest song on the album, and it's kind of cool that it's actually still quite heavy. Perfect Strangers is another one of those awesome, cool Egypto kind of Richie songs. Under the Gun, super heavy. Gypsy's Kiss, I love. Mean Streak is not that great. Hungry Days is kind of like one of those twee and quaint Egypto kind of songs that Richie does. There's a ballad on it that's not so great in Wasted Sunsets. What else we got? Nobody's Home. Many heavy songs on this record. I thought it was a great comeback, very kind of like shiny, and it's got all these well wishes around it by being, made in made in Vermont, and the Sound of Music cabin and all that kind of stuff. They had great times in Vermont and going to the bars and stuff. So it's good seeing these five guys, the classic Mark II lineup, back together. But again, the funny thing about picking this album is, and it's it happens so often on the Contrarians, is the idea that there are these other choices all along, and especially with a great big catalog like Deep Purple, but they all have kind of major flaws to it where you pick 2 or 3 or 4 songs and all of a sudden you're up to half the album and you're not crazy about it. So in rock, I do love, but the production is very cold and clanky. It's almost just a little bit too old for me to be picked as the number one. Machine Head, I'm not a big fan of Smoke on the Water. I'm not a big fan of Lazy. I'm not a big fan of Never Before, but I love Space Truckin' and Highway Star. And there's great songs on that record. Great production by Martin Birch as well. And to be really contrarian, I get a lot of complaints when we all start arguing about this stuff, like me and industry buds, about how much I love the Steve Morse era. I think all those albums are great. And my favorite of all those is one of the dark horses of them. I mean, they made, I think it's 5 albums now. My favorite is Abandon, the second one that they made after Perpendicular. Perpendicular's great too. But I have often, in even more of a belligerent contrarian mood, have picked Abandon as my favorite Deep Purple album. And I point to songs all over that and say, go listen to this. It's an incredible record. But I think all the albums they made there were really good. But I like this album a lot, and I like its sister album, House of Blue Light, right after it. That was a pretty cool album, a little bit smoother. But this is not a record that a lot of people will point to because they will always go to something from the classic era. Burn is another one that's often brought up quite a bit. But I almost feel like, as the years go on and we're whatever it is, 35 years after this record, that it's old enough that people could start bringing it in as choices. But I don't know. I'm sure you have some other things in your notes you might want to say about this whole situation.
Right, well, one of the things, when you mentioned some of the songs, I mean, like Hungry Days is kind of a weaker song. Like you mentioned, Wasted Sunsets is kind of a weaker song. So there are, in my opinion, a couple of weaker songs. But like I said, the songs in general, it's not a bad album, which is a testament to how good of a band Deep Purple is, because even the albums that people debate about are good albums still. Perfect Strangers is a song, every time I listen to it, it reminded me of like Led Zeppelin, kind of Kashmir.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got the same feeling, but like Knocking at Your Back Door is a great song. That's the song I pointed to that sounds, his vocals kind of sound 80s-ish. They remind me of the 80s period, where you can go back and look at more of like the earlier stuff, and it just sounds less dated to me. Again, Perfect Strangers is not a bad album by any means. If I look at some of my notes, it was reviewed pretty poorly by some. Rolling Stone said it hastily knocked off jams that allow Ritchie Blackmore to whip out his finger exercises in public. What else?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't expect Rolling Stone to be too into Deep Purple. I thought it got some good reviews as well. I remember it wasn't too many years after that people started calling it Perfect Wheelchairs, because it's just these old guys. And now, it's funny when you think it's old guys coming back making this album, and now this many years later they're still going.
Well, it was 10 years. Yeah,
later,
it was the first time in 10 years that I think those original Ian Gillan and Ritchie Blackmore had recorded a Deep Purple album together. How much of an effect do you think that had on the production and the songwriting?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, like I say, I never really noticed the production, but now that you mention the vocals, I mean, you think about it, that's a really interesting way to look at it, that Ian is a little more tired, and he gets more tired, of course, as time goes on, but yeah, perhaps the vocals aren't as good as they could have been early on. Your comment about synthesizers, I can't really picture too much synth on it. I think the keyboards are kind of well done. I don't think they're overdone. At this era, they could have made something that sounded more like a hair metal album, and yet they didn't. And I don't think they did on House of Blue Light, and I don't think they even did on Slaves and Masters with Joel and Turner. I think they although that is kind of a poppier record, and that's a little more like the later era Rainbow with Joe. But I think, like a band like AC/DC, they kind of sidestepped that whole thing pretty well. And so I thought Perfect Strangers was a classy, regal, British, solid, and pretty heavy album, maybe heavier than people were expecting. So I remember me and the Buds were all pretty pretty happy with it at the time.
Well, I think like listening to Perfect Strangers, it sounds like classic Deep Purple. Some of those songs, other than the production, could have come off of a Machine Head. Some of the songs on just the production's a little bit different, the sounds a little bit different to me. But like I said, I do like it. How much of a factor do you think nostalgia plays in part when people pick the best album? Because Machine Head was my first Deep Purple album.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if years later, when people say what's the best, I always go to Machine Head because that was my first Deep Purple experience. Do you think that plays a big?
That's a really big point because with Deep Purple spanning so many years, that's where I get a lot of argument where me not picking in rock is considered bad because I'm too sick of it and it's too old. Like saying it's old is like not a good argument. It's an incredible album. It was a landmark, important album. Deep Purple's by far most important album in terms of like groundbreaking music. The whole album is groundbreaking, right? But yeah, the funny thing is, as I said in the beginning, it's almost like now that we are 35 years on, I think that's right, 35, roughly that. So now that we are that far on, this is an old album. When we used to debate this 10 years, 20 years ago, it was still kind of put in that newer thing. So I think it's almost like gaining a little bit in stature and considered coolness because it is so old now all of a sudden. But yeah, Deep Purple has this funny, messy career where they come in and out, and then they do these two with the classic lineup, and then one without, and then the Battle Rages on, which is I think 1993, with the classic lineup again, and then Richie's gone again, and now they've had this lineup where it's essentially, I mean, they've had reasons for members to come and go, but the Steve Morse era is now the most stable lineup they've actually ever had, the longest lasting. Except for those changes, I mean, Steve Morse being in there is a pretty solid thing that they've done, and I love all those records. So, so it almost feels like I'm expressing some nostalgia in picking this over some of the others. Like I say, I could have gone with Abandon, but I think I get a lot of complaints from picking this still. Of people my age and maybe older than me that are saying it's not old enough. It has to be Machine Head, or because Machine Head was such a massive album. It is their big album for obvious reasons. The big hits on it. But yeah, I just think there are flaws on Machine Head. There's things I don't like about In Rock. And when I just add everything up, mathematically almost, I go with Perfect Strangers.
Right. And Perfect Strangers, when it came out, was this big triumphant return too, right?
Yeah.
So maybe some of that luster of like, the return of Deep Purple kind of adds to some people looking at it favorably in terms of like the original. What do you think about the original like Deep Purple albums, like the first Mark One?
I hate
those
that stuff.
up
Yeah, I
contention?
can't stand it. No, I do not like that era at all. The Psych era. They're almost like a Vanilla Fudge kind of band mixed with Psych, very dated. And then they blow that all up and do the classical album, that weird classical thing, and then In Rock happens and it blows the doors wide open. But yeah, in terms of the triumphant return, it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier that everybody was kind of hurting at this point. I mean, Gillan, the Ian Gillan band, and then Gillan the band, and then Born Again. Ian had not much going on. None of that stuff really worked all that well. Whitesnake was not a big band yet, so John Lord and Ian Pace coming out of that thing, that wasn't doing that hot. And then you've got Richie coming from Rainbow, which basically sputtered. It never took off. It's got the Ronnie era, the Graham Bonnet album, the 3 records with Joe Lynn Turner, still not breaking through, never had a gold album. So it did make sense from a business point of view too, that all these guys came back together. And yeah, it's whether that's good or bad. Nobody had anything going on that was that amazing, and they were constantly fielding offers to get back together, and they got a lot of money to do this, and the album did great. It went platinum, which is so cool. That because in this day and age when there are reunions, I mean, I think the public is a lot more ruthless with the whole thing. But at the time, it was big news. It was a big deal. So yeah, great return.
Right, it did go platinum. It didn't sell as much as Machine Head did, but it was very successful. You mentioned Burn earlier. Are those Coverdale albums up for contention for one of the best? Like, would they be in the top 5?
Yeah, I've got a lot of buddies who love Burn and pick that as one of the best with Sail Away and Lay Down, Stay Down, and of course the title track is amazing. It's got some weak stuff on there that people forget. Might Just Take Your Life was cool. Our band in the 80s, we actually played that song. So yeah, that's a pretty cool one, but definitely not Stormbringer. No one talks about Stormbringer. No one really talks about Come Taste the Band. So yeah, I would say Burn.
I think when it got to Come Taste the Band, I think Richie Blackmore and Ian Gillan were out of the band at that point, right?
Yeah. So Richie's replaced by Tommy Bolin, who's there for one album. Good heavy album, solid album, and it sounds pretty Deep Purple-y too. I mean, Tommy is not coming from that headspace at all, but they turn in a pretty Deep Purple-y album at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think about Slaves and Masters? Richie Blackmore says it's one of their best albums. Do you think it's up
Yeah,
there?
that's interesting because it does sound the most like late period Rainbow with Joe, and it just sounds like another one of theirs, and it's quite poppy. It's got a very smooth, organic production sound, which I really like. I like the fact that, again, it's one of these albums of a catalog where you can go back to it because you never quite master it and you're never quite bored of it. So I find it very useful. I play it quite often versus a lot of the other albums. But again, I feel that way also a little bit about all the Steve Morse albums too, which I think are all great. You know, people definitely do complain about Steve Morse. I don't know why they complain about him on the record so much. I can understand why they complain about him live. He definitely is not like Richie. He's his own man, but that comes through a little problematic live. I think the old songs don't have the same anchor or the same tradition or whatever when they play them live, but I love everything he writes with the band. I just think Deep Purple are almost possibly the best example, Uriah Heep as well, of a band doing amazing music now in their late sunset years. Just a great catalog out of those guys, and I think it gives them a lot of great reputation.
One thing about Perfect Strangers is you mentioned you don't really dig the song "Smoke on the Water," but it's so iconic. The people immediately recognize it. As soon as they hear "Smoke on the Water," they recognize it. To me, Perfect Strangers, although a decent album, does not have the one like iconic song that like makes a band. So that's one argument I could put towards not making that the best album, in my opinion.
Yeah, Smoke on the Water is super important. I mean, I think Perfect Strangers, the song, and Knocking at Your Back Door have persevered as super famous Deep Purple songs, but no, nothing's ever going to have the impact of Smoke on the Water. That riff is just hilariously catchy, right? Although the verse, when I think about that song, I try to stand back and go, as iconic as it is, I think it gets muddy and kind of circular and soupy when it comes to the verse. It's an okay song. It doesn't blow me away as much as, Highway Star is fantastic. Space Trucking is fantastic. What's the other one on there? There's a couple of really
Never
cool.
Before.
Not Never Before.
Maybe I'm a Leo.
Yeah, Maybe I'm a Leo is pretty cool too. Pictures of Home. I love Pictures of Home. That's a cool gothic tune. It's really interesting. I mean, the other cool thing about Machine Head is that we're talking 1972. There's breaking rules all over the place. You're not expecting stuff. Perfect Strangers is a little bit more tighter to form. It's a little bit more. The range of everything you get on Perfect Strangers is not that great. I mean, these are basically fairly heavy, although not crazy heavy, but all fairly heavy songs. There's kind of like a straight line that goes through the album, except for the ballad "Wasted Sunsets." But Machine Head is just a creative tour de force all over the place.
Right. Another bar I'd like to kind of measure it at would be if somebody were to come to me and say, I want to get into Deep Purple, what album should I start with? I would not say Perfect Strangers. Mm-hmm. Not that it's a bad album, but I would lead them towards In Rock, or probably Machine Head would be the one that I would tell them to kind of check out. Like, if somebody came to you and asked you, would you steer them towards Perfect Strangers?
But see, that's funny. It's almost like you'd gauge it by how old they are, right? I mean, if you pick somebody who's in their 20s, you'd scare them off by picking some eccentric, weird 70s album, right? They'd go, oh, this is a bunch of crap, right? Perfect Strangers might sound professional enough to their ears that it has at least some semblance of, it reminds them of 80s metal, hair metal, or very professional metal now, depending on what kind of metal they listen to. But it just sounds like the work of a more professional band than the weird 70s stuff. So yeah, it's funny. But I'd almost go to them and say Deep Purple are like 5 different bands, and they're like over 50 years old at this point. What do you want? I mean, they can give you all sorts of crazy stuff. They literally are Probably the most diverse band in all of hard rock when it comes to everything they've gotten up to.
When you're picking a greatest album from a band, do you count live albums? Do you think Made in Japan would be one of the best Deep Purple albums?
No, and that's, boy, you want to talk about being contrarian. I mean, people love Made in Japan. I hate Made in Japan. I can't stand that album or any of the live albums, really, because to me, well, I mean, there's one called Nobody's Perfect later that I like more. Yeah, no, that's not true. I mean, what I like about Nobody's Perfect is what I like about these bands, period. So what I like about Nobody's Perfect is that it's just bang, bang, bang songs. And what I hate about Made in Japan is just all that soloing and stretching everything out. I hate that stuff on live albums. And Ian with his ridiculous singing the guitar solo duo with Richie, I've always hated that stuff. Pulling out the bongos and playing bongos and keyboard solos, guitar solos. I just find all of that ridiculous. So I hate Made in Japan. I hate Made in Europe. Nobody's Perfect. I'm not supposed to like it, and I really don't like it. But what I do like about it is shorter. It's a bunch of songs more so than the other album. But I'm just not a big live albums fan in general. I mean, Deep Purple is terrible for that. Led Zeppelin is terrible for that. The song remains the same. So no, I don't care. I just really do not like live albums.
That one you might get a bit of an argument for, because I know a lot of people that love Made in Japan, but that might be an argument for another day. For today, we'll kind of wrap it up. Did I let Martin off the hook a little too much? If I did, why don't you comment and take all your shots at him, and then in a future episode, we'll kind of go back and look at all the comments, and Martin will get his response to you. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode of The Contrarians. Let us know what you think.